The grand mansion stood tall, its polished windows reflecting the morning sun. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather and freshly brewed coffee. The owner of the house, a wealthy businessman, sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone while his breakfast grew cold. He was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper ego, a man who believed money made him superior to everyone else. In the kitchen, the maid moved quietly, wiping counters and arranging dishes. She was a middle-aged woman with dark skin and calloused hands, a quiet presence in the house. The businessman barely acknowledged her unless he needed something. To him, she was just another servant, invisible and unimportant. That morning, as she dusted the grand piano in the living room, her fingers lightly brushed the keys. A soft, hesitant melody filled the room, just a few notes, but enough to make the businessman look up from his phone. "You play?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. The maid quickly pulled her hands away. "A little, sir. Just something I learned as a child." He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Let's hear it then. Play something proper." The other staff in the house paused, sensing the mockery in his voice. They knew how he was, always looking for a way to belittle those he considered beneath him. The maid hesitated but then sat at the piano, her posture straightening. Her fingers touched the keys again, and this time, the room filled with music so rich and powerful, it was like nothing anyone had ever heard in that house. The notes flowed like a river, strong and graceful, carrying emotions that words couldn't express. The businessman's smirk faded. His coffee sat forgotten as the melody wrapped around them all, pulling them into a world none of them expected. The staff stood frozen, their chores forgotten. Even the businessman, with all his arrogance, couldn't look away. Who was this woman? How could someone he had ignored for years possess such talent? As the last note hung in the air, silence followed. Then, without a word, the maid stood, picked up her dusting cloth, and went back to work as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The businessman stared at the piano, then at her retreating figure. For the first time in his life, he felt small. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. The businessman tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the piano, and the woman who had played it. He had heard world-class musicians perform in concert halls, yet none of them had moved him the way her simple, unplanned melody had. It didn't make sense. How could someone like her, someone he had barely noticed before, have such a gift? That evening, instead of retreating to his study as usual, he lingered near the kitchen. The maid was washing dishes, her hands moving steadily in the soapy water. He cleared his throat, and she turned, drying her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir." He hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. "That song you played earlier, what was it called?" She looked down, as if surprised he had even asked. "Just an old piece, sir. Something my mother taught me." "You play often?" A faint smile touched her lips, but there was something sad in it. "Not in a long time." He wanted to ask more, where she had learned, why she had stopped, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he gave a stiff nod and walked away, annoyed at himself for caring. The next morning, instead of ignoring her as usual, he found himself watching her. She moved through the house like a shadow, efficient and silent. But now, he noticed the way her fingers sometimes twitched, as if they still remembered the piano keys. He noticed the way she hummed under her breath while polishing the silverware, a tune he didn't recognize but that sounded familiar somehow. At lunch, he deliberately left the newspaper open on the table near an article about an upcoming music competition. When she came to clear his plate, he pretended not to see her pause, her eyes scanning the page. "You ever perform in front of people?" he asked suddenly. She stiffened, then shook her head. "No, sir." "Why not?" For the first time, he saw a flicker of something raw in her expression, fear, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Life had other plans for me," she said simply. Before he could press further, the doorbell rang. His sister had arrived for her weekly visit. His sister was as sharp-tongued as he was, but where he was cold, she was openly cruel. She took one look at the maid and wrinkled her nose. Still keeping this one around? I heard the Johnsons hired a much younger girl. Faster, too. The businessman said nothing, but for the first time, the comment bothered him. His sister made herself comfortable in the living room, flipping through a magazine while the maid served tea. Then, without thinking, the businessman said, "She plays piano." His sister laughed. What, like nursery rhymes? The maid's hands tightened around the tray, but she said nothing. No, the businessman said, his voice firmer than he expected. Better than most professionals. His sister raised an eyebrow. Prove it. The air in the room grew heavy. The maid's eyes darted to the businessman, uncertain. He could have laughed it off, could have let his sister's mocking comment hang in the air like always. But something in him needed, to see her play again. He nodded at the piano. The maid took a deep breath, then set the tray down. She walked to the piano, sat, and let her fingers rest on the keys for a moment before she began. And just like before, the room was transformed. His sister's mocking smirk vanished. Her magazine slipped from her hands. The music wasn't just notes, it was a story, one of struggle and quiet strength, of dreams buried but not forgotten. When the last note faded, his sister was silent. Then, in a voice much smaller than before, she muttered, "Well. That was unexpected." The maid stood, her face unreadable, and returned to her duties. But the businessman couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something rare, something real. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been wrong about her all along. That night, the businessman couldn't sleep. The maid's music played over and over in his mind, each note pulling at something deep inside him, something he had buried under years of arrogance. Who was this woman? What kind of life had she lived before quietly serving in his home? The next morning, instead of his usual routine, he found himself standing outside the small, sparse room where the maid slept, a space he had never once bothered to enter. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, on a simple wooden desk, sat a faded photograph. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer. The picture showed a much younger version of the maid, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, standing beside an old piano. Her smile was bright, full of hope. Next to her stood an older woman, her mother, perhaps, with the same proud eyes. Behind them, a sign read, "National Youth Music Competition, First Place." His chest tightened. She hadn't just played piano. She had been brilliant. Later that day, he waited until the house was empty before approaching her. She was folding laundry, her movements slow and tired. "You won a competition," he said bluntly, holding up the photograph. She froze. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, softly, "That was a long time ago." "What happened?" She exhaled, her shoulders dropping. "My mother got sick. No money for doctors, no money for anything. I took whatever work I could find." She smoothed a wrinkle from a shirt, her voice steady but hollow. "After she passed, the piano was sold. The music just stopped." The businessman stared at her. He had assumed her life had always been like this, serving people like him, invisible. But she had dreams. She had talent. And life had crushed both. A strange feeling twisted in his gut, shame. That evening, his sister called, her voice sharp with curiosity. "So, is your maid actually some kind of prodigy, or was that just a fluke?" The businessman clenched his jaw. "She was. Once." "Humph. Well, the Thompsons are hosting a charity gala next month. They're always looking for unique entertainment." There was a sly edge to her words. Imagine the look on their faces if we showed up with her. He knew what his sister was really thinking. She wanted to parade the maid around like some exotic novelty, a servant-turned-performer to shock their wealthy friends. The old him would have agreed. But now, the idea made his skin crawl. "I'll think about it," he muttered before hanging up. The next morning, the maid was dusting the piano again. This time, when her fingers brushed the keys, she didn't pull away. A quiet, mournful tune filled the room, a song of loss, of memories. The businessman stood in the doorway, listening. When she finished, he spoke without thinking. "Would you ever play again? For an audience, I mean." She turned, her eyes wary. "Why?" He struggled to find the right words. "Because, people should hear you." She studied him, as if searching for mockery. But for once, there was none. A sad smile touched her lips. "The world doesn't care about people like me, sir." The truth of her words hit him like a punch. He hadn't cared. Not until now. That night, he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat at the piano himself. His fingers, stiff and clumsy, pressed a single key. The note rang out, lonely and flat. How had she made it sound so easy? He thought of her photograph, of the pride in her younger eyes. Then he thought of the way she looked now, resigned, as if the fire inside her had long since burned out. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe, just maybe, he could fix what he hadn't even realized he'd broken. The businessman sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. Numbers and reports usually demanded his full attention, but today, his mind was elsewhere. The maid's story gnawed at him, how easily a life of promise could unravel. He tapped his fingers impatiently, then made a decision. He found her in the garden, pulling weeds with gloved hands. The morning sun caught the streaks of gray in her hair, and for the first time, he noticed how young she wasn't anymore. Time had passed them both by in different ways. "I want to sponsor you," he said abruptly. She paused, dirt crumbling from her fingers. "Sponsor me?" "Lessons. A proper piano. Whatever you need." The words came out stiff, like he was negotiating a business deal rather than offering a lifeline. She peeled off her gloves slowly, studying him. "And what would you get out of it, sir?" The question stung because it was fair. He'd never done anything without calculating the benefit. But this time. "Maybe just to hear you play again," he admitted. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she shook her head. "It's too late for that." "It's not." He stepped closer, surprising himself with his own urgency. "That competition photo, you were what, 18? You're talented. You could still." "Could still what?" Her voice stayed quiet, but something fiery flickered behind her eyes. "Play at parties so people like your sister can clap and say how charming it is that the help has hidden talents." "No thank you." He flinched. She wasn't wrong, that's exactly what his sister had intended. But that wasn't what he wanted. Not anymore. Before he could explain, his phone buzzed. The Thompson Charity Gala reminder. An idea formed, reckless and unlike him. What if it wasn't like that, he pressed. What if you played somewhere real? A concert hall. No one knowing who you are until you walk out on that stage. She laughed, but it wasn't joyful. "You'd parade me around like some Cinderella story? Rich man saves poor maid?" "No," he met her gaze squarely. "I'd sit in the audience like everyone else. And for once, you'd be the one who's admired." Something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest crack in her armor. Word spread fast among the wealthy circles. At his club, 2 associates cornered him near the whiskey cart. "Heard you've got a virtuoso scrubbing your floors," one sneered. "Planning to train her up like a show pony?" The businessman's grip tightened on his glass. A month ago, he might have laughed along. Now, the joke tasted sour. "She's more talented than anyone in this room," he said coolly. Silence fell. Then incredulous laughter. "Christ, you're serious? Did you fall in love with your maid?" He set down his drink with a sharp clink. "I fell in love with respect. Try it sometime." The stunned looks on their faces followed him out the door. That night, he heard the piano again. Not the careful melodies from before, this was raw, a storm of notes that trembled with decades of pent-up emotion. He crept downstairs to find her playing with her eyes closed, tears glistening on her cheeks. She stopped abruptly when she saw him. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Don't stop because of me." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then her hands returned to the keys, softer now. A question hung in the music: "Can I really believe you?" He had no right to answer. So he just listened. The next morning, a brand new piano arrived, a sleek, professional model that cost more than her yearly salary. She traced a hand over the polished wood, her face unreadable. "It's not a bribe," he said quietly. "It's an apology. For every time I walked past you like you were part of the furniture." She pressed a single key. The note shimmered between them, clear and perfect. "I'll think about it," she said at last. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. And for now, that was enough. The maid stood in front of the new piano for a long time before finally sitting down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. It had been over 20 years since she had touched an instrument of this quality. The weight of those lost years pressed down on her as she opened the bench and saw the empty space where sheet music should have been. That afternoon, she took the bus across town to a storage unit she hadn't visited in a decade. Dust swirled in the air as she unlocked the door, revealing stacks of old boxes. At the very back, under a moth-eaten blanket, was a small wooden chest. Inside lay her past, yellowed sheet music, competition ribbons, and a folded newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local Prodigy Destined for Greatness." Her throat tightened. She had packed these away the day after her mother's funeral, when the bank took their piano and the reality of survival left no room for dreams. Back at the mansion, she spread the music sheets across the piano, her fingers tracing the faded notes. The first few attempts were clumsy, her muscles protesting after years of disuse. But slowly, like a flower pushing through cracked concrete, the music began to return to her. Meanwhile, the businessman faced his own struggles. At a high-profile dinner party, his former friends greeted him with cold smiles and veiled jabs. "So, when does your maid's debut album drop?" one woman mocked, swirling her wine. "I heard he's having her play at his next board meeting," another added. Motivational background music while they discuss layoffs. The businessman set down his fork, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Her name isn't the Maid. It's..." He stopped. A sickening realization hit him: he didn't know her name. For all these years, he had never once asked. The table erupted in laughter at his hesitation, but their cruelty no longer angered him. Only the shame did. That night, he knocked softly on her door. When she opened it, he saw the sheet music spread across her bed and the old newspaper clipping beside it. "I don't know your name," he admitted, the words thick with regret. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "It's Miriam." Miriam. A name, not a title. A person, not a shadow. "Miriam," he repeated, testing the weight of it. "I'd like to hear you play. Properly. If you're willing." She hesitated, then nodded toward the piano. What followed wasn't just music, it was a story. Her fingers flew across the keys, weaving tales of childhood joy, crushing loss, and quiet resilience. When she finished, the air between them had shifted. "Why did you stop playing?" he asked quietly. Miriam smoothed the wrinkled newspaper clipping. The same reason anyone gives up on a dream. Life got in the way. He thought of all the times he'd dismissed her, all the opportunities he'd taken for granted. And now? She looked at the piano, then at her rough, work-worn hands. Now I'm afraid. Of what? That it's too late. The raw honesty of her words hung between them. For the first time, the businessman didn't offer empty reassurance. He simply sat with her in the quiet, letting the truth be heard. The next morning, an unexpected visitor arrived, an elderly man in a tailored suit, his sharp eyes scanning the foyer. The businessman tensed. Father. The old man ignored his son, his gaze locking onto Miriam as she carried a tray of tea. So this is the famous pianist Maid? Miriam's hands didn't shake as she set down the tray. Just the maid, sir. The old man smirked, turning to his son. You're making us a laughingstock. First you parade her around like some circus act, now you've bought her a piano. What's next, sending her to Juilliard? The businessman stepped between them. She's more talented than any musician you've ever hired for your galas. Talent doesn't matter, his father snapped. Position does. Or have you forgotten who you are? Miriam picked up the tray silently and turned to leave. But the businessman caught her arm, gently, just for a second, before letting go. No, father, he said quietly. I think I'm just finally remembering. The old man left in a fury, but neither of them moved until the front door slammed. Miriam exhaled shakily. You shouldn't have done that. I should have done it years ago. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, perhaps even the beginnings of respect. That evening, Miriam played again. But this time, the businessman joined her, sitting not as her employer, but as an audience of one. The music was different now, lighter, freer. As if a door long locked had finally creaked open. Neither of them knew what lay on the other side. But for the first time in decades, they were both willing to find out. The email arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The businessman almost deleted it unread, another charity gala invitation, another night of hollow small talk. But the subject line caught his eye. Your extraordinary pianist, an offer. He clicked. The message was from a renowned music director who had attended his sister's party weeks earlier. I haven't been able to forget the woman who played in your parlor, it read. If she's willing, I'd like to offer her a guest solo spot with the city orchestra next month. The businessman read it twice, then called Miriam into his study. She stood stiffly as he explained, her face unreadable. When he finished, she asked only one question, why? Because you're brilliant, he said simply. She shook her head. No. Why are you doing this? The truth sat heavy on his tongue. Because I wasted years not seeing you. This is how I learned to look. Word of the offer spread. The next evening, the doorbell rang to reveal a striking woman in a designer coat, her smile sharp as broken glass. Well, the woman purred, stepping past the stunned businessman without invitation. I had to see for myself if it was really you. Miriam froze in the hallway, a stack of linens clutched to her chest. Lena. Lena laughed, circling Miriam like a shark. 25 years, and you're still haunting me. First you steal my competition spot, now you're crawling back. The businessman stepped forward. That's enough. Lena ignored him. Still playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1? Or did you finally learn something new while scrubbing floors? Miriam's voice was quiet but steady. I play for myself now. Not for trophies. How noble, Lena sneered. Then she dropped her bomb, I'm the orchestra's lead pianist. If you show up, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you are. When the door slammed behind Lena, Miriam's hands trembled, but not from fear. From fury. I'll do it, she said suddenly. The businessman blinked. What? The performance. I'll play. Her eyes burned with a fire he'd never seen before. Let her try to stop me. The storm broke sooner than expected. 3 days later, a grainy video surfaced online, Miriam at the piano, filmed secretly during one of her practice sessions. The caption read, "Maid or Maestro? Watch this humble servant reveal her true colors." Comments exploded. No way that's real, probably auto-tuned. Rich people will do anything for attention. She's incredible. Why is she working as a maid? Miriam shut her laptop, her face pale. This is exactly what I didn't want. The businessman reached for his phone. I'll have it taken down. No, she took a deep breath. The world already knows. Now I have to decide who controls the story, them or me. His father struck next. A letter arrived by courier. End this farce, or the board will vote to remove you as CEO. We won't let the family name become a joke. The businessman crumpled the paper. That night, he found Miriam at the piano, playing the same 4 measures over and over, her brow furrowed. You're hesitating, he observed. She glared at the keys. Lena was right about one thing, this piece is my old competition song. What if I've been clinging to the past? He sat beside her. Then play something new. I don't know anything new. So learn. He reached past her, plucking a modern composition from the stack. Start tonight. Their hands brushed, and for a fleeting second, the mansion's rigid walls seemed to dissolve. At 3 a.m., the businessman woke to the sound of piano music, not the polished perfection from before, but something raw and stumbling. He crept downstairs to find Miriam wrestling with the new piece, her hair messy, her slippers tapping the rhythm. She didn't stop when she saw him. It's awful. It's brave, he countered. A wrong note rang out. She laughed, genuinely, for the first time in his memory. It's terrible. But she kept playing. And he kept listening. By dawn, something miraculous had happened, the clumsy notes had woven themselves into music. Not perfect, not yet, but alive. Just like both of them. The concert hall was colder than Miriam expected. She stood backstage in a simple black dress, not the maid's uniform she'd worn for decades. Not the competition gowns of her youth, just her. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her like a physical thing. Lena appeared beside her, holding 2 sheet music folders. Nervous, she smirked. Miriam said nothing. Don't worry, Lena whispered, leaning close. By measure 42, everyone will understand their mistake. She pressed a folder into Miriam's hands and disappeared into the shadows. When Miriam opened the folder, her stomach dropped. The pages were subtly altered, wrong notes planted like landmines, timing marks erased. A sabotage designed to humiliate her mid-performance. Her fingers trembled. Then she remembered the businessman's words, play something new. She tossed Lena's folder aside. Out in the audience, the businessman sat stiffly between his sneering sister and stone-faced father. The murmurs around them were relentless. Is this some kind of charity stunt? I heard she's never had formal training. That's the CEO's maid, can you imagine? His phone buzzed with a board member's text, last chance to withdraw. Final vote at 9 a.m. tomorrow. He powered it off just as the lights dimmed. The stage lights blinded Miriam at first. The grand piano gleamed like an open mouth, waiting to devour her. For one terrifying second, she considered fleeing. Then she saw him, the businessman, sitting ramrod straight in the 3rd row. Not smiling, not nodding encouragement, just watching. As if for this moment alone, he was finally seeing her. She sat. Breathed. And began to play, not Chopin, not Lena's sabotaged piece, but something entirely her own. The first notes were tentative, a musical question, "Can I do this?" Then the melody found its strength. What poured from her fingers wasn't just technique, it was every missed chance, every silent year, every dream deferred. The music swelled with the rage of being overlooked and the joy of being found. The audience vanished. Lena vanished. There was only the piano, her hands, and the astonishing realization. I'm still here. Backstage, Lena's smirk dissolved into shock. This wasn't the piece they'd rehearsed. This wasn't anything she recognized. And it was breathtaking. The businessman's sister gripped his arm. "You knew," she accused. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The music had reached a passage so vulnerable, so human, that his vision blurred. For the first time in his life, he understood what art was for. His father stood abruptly and walked out. The businessman didn't follow. Miriam reached the final movement, a series of ascending chords that built and built, like someone climbing out of a dark place. When the last note hung in the air, the silence was absolute. Then the storm broke. The applause wasn't polite. It was a roar. People leapt to their feet, shouting, some openly weeping. Miriam swayed, dizzy with adrenaline, as the stage manager whispered, "They're calling for an encore." She turned to the wings, and saw Lena standing there, face pale, clutching the sabotaged sheet music. Their eyes met. Miriam expected fury. Instead, Lena gave the smallest nod. Respect. Miriam turned back to the piano. The businessmen fought through the backstage crowd to find her afterward. Miriam sat alone on a dressing room stool, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "You," his voice cracked. "You were magnificent." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I forgot what it felt like to be heard." A knock interrupted them. The music director burst in, waving his phone. "We have 15 requests for interviews. The symphony wants to offer you a permanent." "No," Miriam stood. "Not yet." The director blinked. "But the publicity is yours to manage." She smoothed her dress. "I have somewhere to be." The businessmen followed her out, confused, until they reached the staff parking lot, where every maid, cook, and groundskeeper from his estate stood cheering, their work uniforms swapped for their best clothes. The head chauffeur thrust a bouquet into Miriam's arms. "We pooled our tips," he grinned. Miriam buried her face in the flowers, shoulders shaking. The businessmen realized, with a jolt, that this was her real audience. The people who'd known her value all along. That night, the businessman sat in his study, staring at his resignation letter. His phone lit up with frantic calls, the board, his father, the press. He ignored them all. A soft knock. Miriam entered, still in her performance dress. "You're really giving it up?" she asked, nodding at the letter. "It was never mine to begin with." He met her gaze. "But your music always was." She sat across from him, the maid and the master, the artist and the audience. The lines between them had blurred beyond recognition. "What now?" he asked. Miriam smiled faintly. "Now we both get to find out." The morning after the performance, the businessmen woke to silence. No assistants calling, no board members demanding answers. Just sunlight streaming through the windows of a home that no longer felt like his. Downstairs, he found Miriam in the kitchen, not serving, but sitting at the table with a cup of tea, reading the newspaper. The headline blared, "From Maid to Maestro, the unlikely rise of a musical prodigy." She looked up when he entered. "They spelled my name wrong," she said dryly. He poured his own coffee, a first, and sat across from her. The ordinary act felt revolutionary. "What do you want to do now?" Miriam traced the rim of her cup. "I thought I'd play. Just play." No competitions, no galas. Maybe teach some kids who can't afford lessons. She met his eyes. And you? He exhaled. Learn how to make my own coffee, apparently. A real smile broke across her face, the first he'd ever earned. The world wasn't done with them yet. By noon, reporters camped at the gates. The businessman's father issued a statement disowning his wayward son. The symphony called hourly, begging Miriam to reconsider their offer. She watched the chaos from the piano bench, fingers idly testing chords. You could still go back, she offered. He stood at the window, watching a news van jostle for position. To what? A life of pretending I'm better than people like you? People like me, she repeated softly. Then she played a bright, mocking scale. Funny. I don't feel like people like me anymore. The businessman, no, just a man now, turned. Good. They left that night in the chauffeur's old sedan, slipping past the media circus. The car stopped outside a modest apartment building. Miriam's building. You're sure about this? He asked as she gathered her things. She paused, her hand on the door. Come up. There's something you should see. The elevator smelled of cabbage and cleaning solution. Her apartment was tiny, a single room with a hot plate, a neatly made bed, and in the corner, a child's electric keyboard. My retirement plan, she said wryly, plugging it in. The cheap speakers buzzed as she played a few notes. He stared. You practice that on this? Every night. Her fingers danced over the plastic keys, conjuring magic from machinery. Turns out it wasn't the piano that mattered. Something cracked open in his chest. The next months were strange and wonderful. Miriam gave free lessons at community centers. He, James, his name was James, learned to cook pasta without burning it. The press moved on to newer curiosities. One rainy afternoon, they found themselves at a thrift store. Miriam unearthed a warped vinyl record. Mozart's Requiem, she grinned. My mother's favorite. James dug in his pocket, a habit he was still breaking, but she'd already paid with her own money. That night, listening to the scratchy recording in her apartment, he asked the question that had haunted him. Do you regret it? The life you might have had? Miriam watched the record spin. I regret not playing. But the rest? She shook her head. This life made my music what it is. The needle jumped. A choir swelled through the static. Spring came. On a park bench near Miriam's apartment, James opened a letter, his first paycheck from the music school where he now handled bookings. The sum was laughable compared to his old salary. It felt like treasure. Miriam sat beside him, flipping through a student's halting composition. They want me to play at the mayor's fundraiser, she mentioned. Are you going? She shrugged. If you'll come with me. A breeze ruffled the papers. Somewhere nearby, a street musician's violin wove through the city's noise. James reached over and straightened the sheet music in her hands, not to correct, just to help. I'll be there, he promised. Not as her employer. Not as her patron. Just as James. And that, at last, was enough.